Hey guys, tonight we're stepping straight into the cold mud of a medieval village winter. Your breath puffs out like smoke in the icy morning air, and everything around you, from the thatch above your bed to the frost-bitten soil outside, is touched with a cruel, lingering chill. No central heating, no wool-blend socks or Gore-Tex jacket, just you, your raw fingers, and a small fire that's been dead for hours. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere cold tonight, let me know in the comments where you are and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up inside a one-room cottage. The roof leaks slightly, and your breath comes out in silvery clouds. The hearth is stone cold, and your blanket? It's a worn bit of scratchy wool that smells faintly of smoke and sweat. You're sleeping in your clothes because undressing would be, frankly, suicidal. Medieval knights didn't mess around. You don't hop out of bed so much as peel yourself from it, layers sticking to your skin. Your toes feel like brittle pebbles. The window shutter is frozen half shut. Light barely spills in, and what does is grim and gray. Outside, the earth is stiff with frost, puddles glazed with a thin layer of ice that cracks underfoot. The wind is already whining against the wood-slatted walls. Welcome to a winter's morning sometime around the 14th century. No microwave oatmeal, no radiator humming in the corner. Just survival, one itchy garment at a time. You reach for the nearest tunic. It's rough, coarsely woven, probably made from wool and cut with a dull blade. It isn't warm in itself, but it's better than your undershirt, if you even have one. Most people didn't own more than 2 or 3 garments total. Clothes weren't fashion. They were armor, against cold, against rain, against the endless slap of wind across bare fields. Now, just imagine for a moment. No zippers, no elastic, and no synthetic anything. Dressing was a deliberate, often painful act. You tug cloth over your limbs and pull a drawstring at your waist. The knot's stiff with frozen spit where you tied it last night. If you're lucky, you've got a belt, a strip of leather or braided flax to cinch your middle and keep your outer tunic in place. And yet, here's the strange bit. Despite all this misery, you're technically among the luckier villagers. You've got clothes. You're inside. Some poor souls sleep in barns, some in lean-tos, some beside pigs, stealing warmth wherever they can find it. Medieval chroniclers often mentioned people freezing in doorways or dying of winter fever, a catch-all term that likely included hypothermia. Historians still argue whether those deaths were mostly due to the cold or the diseases that came with it. But the result was the same. People didn't wake up. You head outside, carefully, feet numb. The chickens have frost on their feathers. The ground crunches with each step, and you realize something else. The wind goes through you. Not around you, not over you, through you. Because medieval fabrics weren't windproof. Most of your clothes are loosely woven wool, barely treated. You can feel every gust as if you're naked. No polyester shell here, friend. Just raw sheep and a prayer. The firewood you chopped yesterday is damp. Everything is damp. You try to start the fire anyway. You fumble with flint and steel, hoping the tiny spark catches. The smoke makes your eyes water. Your fingertips go red, then white, then nothing. You rub them against your tunic, but the wool's coarse, like sanding your own hands. And yes, splinters. Even your clothes are trying to kill you. And then there's the smell. Because here's a cozy detail. Medieval people didn't wash winter clothes often, if ever. Wool shrinks, linen tears, soap is rare. So most garments absorb a full season's worth of sweat, smoke, stew spills, and sometimes worse. You're basically wearing a crusty, centuries-old nose joke. Still, the villagers adapt. They have to. They dry their clothes over smoky fires. They layer whatever they can find: moss, straw, rags, or stitch together patches from old garments. Anything to fill gaps and trap body heat. Kids sometimes sleep under sheep hides. Adults wrap feet in cloth, or even slip them into warm animal guts fresh from slaughter. Yep, that happened. Desperate times. One odd custom pops up in scattered records. The use of witch moss, real name Hypnum cupressiform. It's a soft moss that grew in forests and marshes. Some medieval folks dried it and lined garments or shoes with it, claiming it kept in heat and warded the bite of ice spirits. No evidence for that last part, obviously, but still, points for creativity. And here's a quirky linguistic tidbit. The phrase "to catch your death" wasn't always figurative. In winters like this, catching cold could mean pneumonia, or worse. And yet, there you are, already outside, feeding the goats, your nose dribbling like a tap, trying to move your fingers again. Maybe you eye the neighbor's cloak, a shaggy thing made of animal hide. It smells like an entire wet dog convention and looks heavier than your average toddler. But it works, barely. Richer folk got fancier layers, fur linings, silk underthings, imported materials. You have wool, some string, and optimism. You spend the morning dreaming of fire, or bread, or the sun just showing up for once. But mostly, you dream of warmth, of not feeling like your skin is retreating from your bones, of not having to brace every time a gust of wind sneaks under your hemline. Winter isn't coming, it's here, and your tunic, wet from a surprise snow, has started to stiffen. The first thing to touch your skin, if you even own one, is linen. Thin, unforgiving, and scratchy where it hasn't been softened by years of wear. It's not warm, not really, but it's better than putting raw wool straight on your already chapped back. This is your undertunic, your next to skin, the medieval version of long underwear, except it doesn't stretch, it doesn't wick moisture, and it definitely doesn't smell like lavender detergent. It smells like you. Maybe also the sheep. Linen, surprisingly, was common across much of medieval Europe. Spun from flax, it took forever to make. Harvesting, retting, beating, spinning, weaving. You basically had to wrestle the plant into submission before it became fabric. And yet, for those who could afford the time, or the woman hours more accurately, it became the go-to for underclothing. Wool was itchy, linen was less itchy. That was the bar. So you start with your shirt or chemise if you're a woman. Maybe you have a spare, but probably not. It's long, falling to your thighs or knees, and if you're male, you tuck it into your hose. If you're female, it layers beneath your dress. There's no modesty in the morning chill, just speed. The fire isn't lit yet. Your joints are stiff. You pull it over your head like a knight donning armor, gritting your teeth against the static, laced cold. But here's the hilarious irony. Linen gets colder when damp. So the second you start sweating from chores, or just the nervous pacing around your cold hut, it clings to your skin like ice paper, which is why most medieval people didn't have the luxury of changing daily. You wore the same thing until it practically walked away on its own. Now for your second layer. Another tunic, this one wool. It's coarser, thicker, and dyed a brownish tone that might once have been green. It has no buttons. Buttons aren't common yet. Laces? Maybe. More likely, it's held closed with a brooch, or just hangs there, loose and shapeless. A medieval tunic didn't flatter. It smothered. The goal wasn't style. It was survival. Here's something historians love to debate. How much layering was actually normal for the lower classes? Some argue peasants went out with just 2 layers, linen and wool. Others point to manorial accounts, where servants were allotted up to 3 or even 4 garments each winter, and say, no, they layered more than we think. Maybe the truth lies in the middle, as it often does in history. Your layers depend on status, climate, and whether your only tunic hasn't been stolen, burnt, or lost in the local pond. Over the tunic, if you're fortunate, comes a surcoat or over tunic. Think of it like a medieval hoodie without the hood, sometimes sleeveless, sometimes short-sleeved, often passed down so many generations that no one remembers who first wore it. These were patched, constantly, holes stitched with whatever was handy, thread, horsehair, or strips of other clothes, a walking quilt of desperation. There's a common misconception that medieval people didn't understand layering. But oh, they did. Maybe better than we do. You didn't survive January by being fashionable. You wore everything you had, sometimes inside out, sometimes in combinations that would terrify modern tailors. Wool, on moss, on hope. Here's a fun fringe tidbit. In certain Scandinavian regions, folks sometimes lined their clothes with dried grass or hay, stuffed into seams or between layers, not to show off, just to avoid freezing to death. And yes, it rustled when they walked. Basically, you could mistake someone for a mobile scarecrow. Still, it worked. As you shift and move, the layers warm slightly from your body heat. It's not cozy, but it's better than the alternative. You pull your sleeves down over your hands, you flex your fingers and wonder if the feeling will return. Somewhere outside, a rooster crows. He sounds just as cold as you feel. You glance toward the hearth. Maybe later, when you're back from gathering brushwood, you'll relight it. But you need fuel first. The village commons don't supply themselves. And your legs, still bare beneath that tunic. You'd better fix that too. But before we move downward, let's not forget the sheer psychology of dressing. Putting on layers in a freezing cottage wasn't just about staying warm. It was a ritual, a form of defiance. Every added piece said, nope, not dying today. That's a kind of power. A small, threadbare power, stitched with resolve and probably 1 or 2 lice. Speaking of stitching, needlework mattered more than you think. If a sleeve ripped, you didn't toss it. You stitched it while walking, while minding goats, while pretending not to notice your neighbor's unusually furry cloak. Needle and thread were survival tools. Husbands might spin yarn. Wives sewed it into salvation. And on feast days, or honestly, any day a churchwarden came sniffing around, you might wear your good tunic. The one not entirely caked with mud and cabbage soup. The one with sleeves that weren't singed. Maybe. Some households had communal items too. Clothes shared across siblings, generations, even neighbors in desperate cases. Your coat wasn't your coat. It was the family coat, the village coat, the someone died in this but we washed it so here you go coat. And here's the kicker. After all that dressing, after all that effort, you still weren't warm. You were simply less cold than before, which, in medieval winter, was as close to comfort as most people ever got. You're fully layered now, and yet the chill still finds its way in. Through seams, around cuffs, into the collar where your neck still shows pale and exposed. You take a deep breath, It fogs instantly. Time to face the day. The goal isn't fashion. The goal is not dying. And to do that, you keep layering. You're not just getting dressed. You're assembling your survival kit, one itchy, semi-damp garment at a time. You've got your linen underlayer, your main wool tunic, maybe a second if you're lucky. But winter laughs at 2 layers. It seeps into your bones, makes your joints ache, turns your breath into sharp needles in your lungs. So you add more. Another tunic, maybe a surcoat, maybe something you borrowed and forgot to return. You start to resemble a fabric onion. The richer you are, the more layers you can afford. If you're a noble, you might have a padded coat-hardy, a fur-lined houppelande, maybe even a mantle trimmed with squirrel or ermine. If you're not noble, and you aren't, you're lucky to have mismatched sleeves. Clothing wasn't tailored so much as shaped vaguely toward the idea of a human. Nothing quite fits. Everything bunches. You constantly tug and readjust, like a sleep-deprived actor in a never-ending peasant play. Some layers are so worn they've lost all insulating power. They're more symbolic than practical, like wearing a memory, but you don't take them off, not in January. A useless tunic is still better than the bitter kiss of wind on bare skin. And besides, there's something weirdly comforting about the sheer weight of all those garments pressing down on you. You feel buried in fabric, swaddled, trapped, safe. Now you reach for your girdle, not the modern type. This is a long cloth or rope belt, wrapped around your middle, often several times, tied in front. Not just to hold your layers in place, but to attach useful things. A pouch, a knife, a wooden spoon. In some places, people hung charms or talismans from it to ward off illness or frostbite. Historians still argue whether these items were mostly practical or superstitious, but either way, they gave people a sense of control in a world where control was limited, to say the least. By now, your upper body is mostly wrapped. Your movement is restricted. You feel like you're wearing your entire life, which, in a way, you are. Most people in the Middle Ages could count their clothing on one hand. There were no wardrobes. Just whatever you owned, whatever you hadn't worn to pieces, and whatever hadn't been stolen, eaten by rats, or accidentally dropped in the fire. It happens more often than you'd think. And there was a hierarchy to these layers. The cleaner, better preserved tunics were saved for holidays, weddings, or visits from the reeve. Everyday clothes bore stains from grease, smoke, manure, and food, sometimes all at once. There were no dry cleaners. If your shirt caught fire, you patted it out and kept wearing it. One 13th century diary mentions a man who wore the same brown tunic until it could no longer be patched, only layered, which is a deeply medieval way of saying, this is now a shirt-shaped patchwork quilt. Now for your outermost defense, a cloak. If you have one. This is a rectangle of wool, fastened at the shoulder with a pin, or just draped over you like a portable blanket. Cloaks were catch-alls, windbreakers, privacy screens, bedrolls, even makeshift tents. Some peasants shared a single cloak between multiple family members, rotating it based on who was going out into the cold. It wasn't uncommon to see a child shivering in rags while his older brother wore the cloak to gather firewood. Not fair, just practical. Cloaks weren't tailored either. They were hemmed if you had the time, lined if you had the money. Otherwise, they frayed, got heavy when wet, made you look like a slowly collapsing tent. But they worked, sort of. There were no coat hooks in medieval houses, no closets. You folded your cloak under your body to sleep, hung it over the rafter beams if you had any, or just balled it up next to the fire and hoped no one used it to mop the floor. Cloaks were communal, personal, symbolic. Some folks embroidered them with family patterns or devotional images, crosses, saints, strange runes copied from someone else who barely knew Latin. And here's a strange bit. In some northern communities, people made cloaks from felted wool panels, wool that had been boiled, pounded, and pressed until it became a kind of dense, water-resistant mat, heavy as sin, stiffer than dried porridge. But it blocked wind like a dream. Well, like a medieval dream. Which is to say, it still mostly sucked, but less than freezing. All this layering came with problems. You overheated easily. You couldn't move quickly. You couldn't bend down without exposing your hips to the cold, or worse, tearing something. You stank. Everything itched. And if you got wet, crossing a stream, falling in snowdrift, misjudging a puddle, it was game over. Wet wool doesn't dry fast. Wet linen might freeze solid. And you? You trudge on, waddling like a sheepish bagpipe. Oh, and remember that these layers weren't gender neutral. Women's garments were longer, heavier, harder to walk in. Hemlines dragged through snow and manure. Dresses soaked up slush. You could tell how poor someone was by the tide mark of filth climbing their skirts. For noble women, servants helped keep the fabric off the ground. For everyone else, you just lifted and cursed your way down the path. Children wore hand-me-downs that were too big, too small, or patched so often the original cloth was a mystery. One child might wear their older brother's tunic over a rope belt tied 5 times around. Babies? Swaddled in anything, rags, felt scraps, bits of fur, even moss. Yes, moss again. It was the medieval duct tape of winter wear. The result of all this? A medieval person walking down a village lane in January looked less like a human and more like an ambulatory laundry pile. But it worked, just barely. So you step outside now, bundled like a turnip, rustling with every movement, your breath catching on wool fibers near your face. You're not comfortable, but you're alive. And in the Middle Ages, that's enough. Now that your torso is cocooned under a mess of linen, wool, and dignity-strangling cordage, it's time to turn your attention to a truly sacred mission, keeping your head warm. Because once the cold sinks in up top, everything else follows. You could have 10 layers below the neck, but if your ears are ringing and your scalp is numb, it's like trying to heat a house with the front door wide open. The medieval answer to this wasn't a beanie or thermal hood. It was the coif. A snug-fitting linen cap tied under the chin like an early prototype baby bonnet, but make it peasant core. The coif was a staple. Everyone wore it. Men, women, even kids. It didn't insulate much by itself, but it trapped a little heat, kept the hair in check, and acted as a base layer for other head coverings. You tug yours on now, fumbling with the ties under your chin. It's stained, like everything else, and has a tear stitched roughly near the crown. But it does the job. Over it, you add your hood, the real MVP of medieval winter survival. This is not just a hood like the one on your sweatshirt. It's a fully separate garment, often called a chaperone, that drapes over the shoulders and sometimes the upper chest and back. Think fabric helmet meets scarf meets medieval neck blanket. Made of thick wool and often double layered, it protects your ears, head, and neck all in one go. Richer folks sometimes lined theirs with fur, or wore longer liripipes, the long tail of fabric that hung from the back like a floppy unicorn horn. Poorer folks made do with simpler versions, sometimes trimmed with moss or straw for a bit of added warmth and a faint resemblance to a compost bin. And here's where it gets entertaining. Medieval hoods were weirdly fashionable. In the 14th century, there was a trend among young men to wear their hoods in absurd, sculptural ways. Instead of letting the liripipe hang down the back, they'd wrap it around their heads like a padded crown. Some coiled it like a cinnamon roll. Others tied it into horns. It didn't keep anyone particularly warmer, but hey, when you have one garment to your name, you get creative. You, however, aren't one of those fashionable lads. You're just cold, so you pull your hood forward, tucking it tight around your cheeks. It's damp near the mouth, probably from your own breath freezing and melting again. That's normal. That's medieval life. Warmth means moisture. Moisture means discomfort. Comfort is a rumor that died out around the Norman conquest. Sometimes, if you're especially cold, or your hood's seen better days, you layer it with a mantle, a circular piece of cloth worn over the shoulders and chest, kind of like a poncho but heavier, uglier, and 700% itchier. Mantles helped trap rising body heat, especially around the upper chest and neck where major blood vessels run close to the skin. Keep that area warm, and your whole system functions better, or at least, it doesn't shut down immediately. Now, let's talk about facial protection. Scarves weren't really a thing. Not in the modern, fluffy, cozy sense, but strips of cloth could be wrapped around the lower face, especially if you were traveling in harsh winds. Some records mention shepherds or travelers tying sashes over their mouths and noses to prevent frostbite and windburn. You'd look like a particularly underfunded ninja, but again, nobody was judging. In extremely cold regions, or during travel, people sometimes wore fur caps. These weren't sleek hats with ear flaps and clever branding. These were literal pieces of animal hide, shaped and stitched into crude domes. The fur faced inward, the skin faced out. If you were lucky, the animal had been cleaned. If not, well, welcome to the aroma of medieval roadkill couture. But warmth first, dignity later. Here's a quirky fringe fact. In parts of Eastern Europe, some folks line their winter hoods with rabbit skins. Soft, light, and oddly effective. Rabbit fur was easy to come by and considered expendable. One 15th century Baltic account describes children with caplets of many ears, suggesting someone stitched entire rabbit pelts, ears and all, into makeshift headgear. Functional? Yes. Fashion forward? You decide. Meanwhile, in the church, head coverings were mandatory, especially for women. Married women in particular had to cover their hair in public, and often indoors too. Which means that winter was both a religious and a seasonal excuse to add more head layers. You might wear a wimple, a cloth draped over the neck and chin, or a veil over your coif. Each layer trapped a bit more warmth, even if it made you look like you were perpetually heading to a funeral. Some people even slept in headgear. That's how vital it was. Bed caps made of linen or wool, kept in the precious heat that tried to sneak out through your scalp in the night. And when your walls are uninsulated and your mattress is a sack of straw, you wear anything that stops your head from turning into an icicle by dawn. You step outside now, hood pulled low, face half wrapped in cloth. The wind slaps the fabric against your cheek, but it doesn't sting quite so bad. Your ears are still intact. Your nose still attached. You pass your neighbor, who's wearing what looks like a bundle of rags twisted into a turban. He nods. His beard has frost in it. Neither of you speaks. Too cold. Historians still debate how universal these headwear customs were. In warmer climates, fewer layers were needed. In harsher regions, some layers aren't even recorded. They were just assumed. Folk memory. Oral tradition. We wore what worked. No one needed to write it down when everyone already knew you didn't go out in January bareheaded, unless you wanted to hallucinate your dead relatives by sundown. So here you are, walking down a frost-hardened track in your wool-stuffed, moss-fringed hoodie, a coif clinging to your scalp, a chaperone tugged tight around your chin. You look like the kind of person who'd be cast as peasant 4, dying of cold in a medieval stage play. But the thing is, you're surviving. And that's what every head covering was really for. Your torso's buried under wool. Your head's a mobile haystack of linen and felt. But now comes the real test. Your legs. They've been exposed too long already, and the wind is making your knees beg for mercy. There are no jeans, no thermal leggings, no fleece-lined jogging pants, just a medieval leg problem waiting for a very creative solution. The first weapon in your lower body defense is the hose. Not the stretchy kind your gym teacher wore, but long tubes of wool, cut and stitched to roughly resemble the shape of your leg. One for each side. They don't always connect at the top. Sometimes they're tied to your belt with thin laces or points, a practice that somehow manages to be both fussy and completely ineffective against sagging. The hose sag anyway. Always. You sit down, shivering, and start pulling on the first leg. It's itchy. It has a hole at the knee, hastily sewn with a darker thread. The foot is reinforced with extra layers, though you can still feel every bump in the floor through the threadbare sole. You pull up the second one, tie it to your girdle, and stand. Already, one side is drooping. That's just how hose work. If you're a woman, it's a little different. You're wearing a long wool kirtle or dress, maybe with an apron over it. Beneath that, if you have hose at all, they're shorter and not tied up, which means they slip down frequently, especially if you're walking, bending, or doing literally anything except standing still in a perfectly vertical position. That's when you reach for leg wraps. Think woolen bandages for your calves and shins. They're long strips of cloth, wrapped spirally up the leg like modern gaiters or, let's be honest, poor man's mummy wrappings. They keep the hose from sagging, add warmth, and sometimes even deflect minor injuries, which is useful when you're stumbling through a thicket to fetch firewood and don't fancy being stabbed in the shin by a malicious twig. Some wraps are tucked into your shoes. Others are tied off with string, leather thongs, or just wedged tight and hoped to stay put. They always loosen. Everything in medieval fashion loosens. You spend half your day retying things, the other half trying not to trip over them. And here's the strange part. Legs are rarely depicted in detail in most medieval art. Tunics hang low, cloaks cover everything, and hose blur into boots. But archaeological finds, like those frozen bodies found in peat bogs or buried in ice, reveal the sheer ingenuity of legwear. One Greenland body had moss-stuffed socks wrapped in hide. Another wore a double-layered woolen hose reinforced at the knees with what appears to be rabbit fur? Historians still argue whether it was sewn in deliberately or just left from a skin used in a pinch. You take a step outside now. Your hose immediately betray you. The left one slips an inch. The right is tight around the ankle and flapping near the thigh. You grimace, bend over, adjust. It's a dance you'll repeat 20 times before lunch. But what about underwear, you ask? Good question. If you're male, you might be wearing brays, baggy linen shorts gathered at the waist with a cord. Think bloomers, but sadder. They hang mid-thigh or longer, and in cold weather, you might tuck your hose into them. Some illustrations show men with the tops of their hose rolled over the waistband of their brays, giving the entire outfit the charm of a malfunctioning diaper. If it keeps you warm, you don't care. Women? No brays. Not usually. There's no firm evidence of female underpants in early medieval Europe, though fringe examples pop up occasionally in upper-class wardrobes. For most, the wool dress and chemise are your only defense, and if a breeze catches the hem just right, well, let's hope your kirtle is long and the saints are feeling merciful. Now remember, warmth wasn't evenly distributed. Nobles had better wool, denser weaves, imported materials, even padded hose, sometimes stuffed with cotton or down feathers. You've got homespun fabric, probably warped during weaving, dyed with onion skin, and reeking faintly of last month's stew. A fascinating fringe trick used by peasants? Stuffing the hose. Not just with moss or straw for shoes, but with animal hair, goat, horse, even dog. It itched like betrayal, but added insulation. You'd shear a beast, comb out the finer hairs, and shove them between hose and skin like nature's space heater. Did it work? Sort of. Until it started to shift and clump, and then you just looked like your calves were infested with moving hay bales. Now your legs are wrapped, your hose sagging but mostly intact, and you're shuffling along like a bundled sack of frozen barley. The mud is half ice. Your feet slide. You catch yourself on a fence post and curse gently under your breath. Nothing too rude. It's Sunday. Or maybe it's Tuesday. Time has a way of blurring when the days are only separated by how many times you have to thaw your socks. And that brings us to modesty. Because despite the layers, the cold, and the full-body potato sack aesthetic, medieval people still had standards. Exposing one's legs, especially the thighs, was often frowned upon. Unless you were a noble in tights performing courtly dances, bare legs were considered a bit too scandalous for casual exposure, which is hilarious when you remember most men were wearing tied-up wool stockings and glorified bloomers with no fly. But society clutches its pearls where it can. Some regions, especially Germanic territories, developed what's called joined hose earlier than others. Instead of two separate legs, these were stitched together and had a flap at the back or front for, access. They were warmer, more secure, also more complicated to sew, which meant most peasants just kept to the single leg system, readjusting constantly and praying it didn't snow sideways. So there you are, finally upright, legs semi-protected, socks stuffed with grass and questionable optimism, knees knocking gently like dice in a wooden cup. It's not graceful. It's not elegant. But you're dressed, you're decent, and you probably won't lose a toe this morning. Feet. The final frontier of medieval misery. You can bundle your chest, double wrap your head, and tie up your hose like a determined caterpillar. But if your toes freeze, none of it matters. You learn this quickly out here, trudging through snow-slicked mud in footwear that wouldn't survive 10 minutes in a modern puddle. So let's look down at your shoes, or rather your approximate shoes, because medieval footwear was more suggestion than solution. The standard? Simple turn shoes, thin leather, stitched inside out and then flipped, hence the name. They resemble soft moccasins, offer little support, and provide about the same warmth as 2 slices of raw ham strapped to your soles. Once wet, they stay wet. Once cold, they become little frozen coffins for your toes. You pull yours on now. They're stiff, the leather cracked. The laces, just twisted cords of hemp, snap if you tug too hard. So you tie them gently, with frozen fingers. Inside the shoes? Stuffed straw, because that's your best bet for insulation. Straw, moss, even dried leaves. Whatever you can cram in there to create a buffer between your skin and the biting ground. And yes, it pokes, itches, crumbles into clumps by noon, but it's warmer than nothing. Some people used hair fur or rabbit pelts, wrapping them around their feet before slipping into their shoes. The fur went inward, the hide out. If you're really fancy, or just smart, you tie the fur directly to your ankle with a bit of gut or sinew, then pull the shoe over the top. It looks like you're about to go ice fishing with nothing but a squirrel and hope, but the warmth payoff is real. And socks? Sort of. Foot wraps were more common. Squares or rectangles of cloth, wool if you had it, wrapped around the foot and secured at the ankle. They had to be rewrapped regularly, or they'd twist and rub your feet raw. If you're lucky, you've got nail-binding socks, a sort of proto-knitting method found in Norse and Anglo-Saxon graves. Time-consuming to make, they were prized heirlooms. A pair could last a generation if patched. If you had nail-binded socks, you were sock royalty. But most peasants didn't have time to learn nail-binding, so they made do. Wraps, scraps, a lucky chunk of sheepskin. Some even wore wooden clogs over their turn shoes, especially in the Low Countries, where winters were wet and streets a swampy mess. The clogs weren't warm, but they lifted your foot above the worst of the muck. Kind of like medieval platform heels, except instead of impressing people, they mostly kept you from getting trench foot. Now you're standing in your sad leather shoes, filled with straw, wrapped in wool, toes curled like a dead spider. The ground is frozen. Every stone jabs upward like a tiny dagger. You walk heel to toe, trying not to let your feet slap too hard. It's not elegant, but it's winter. Nobody expects grace from someone who just stepped in cow dung and didn't notice until it froze to their heel. And speaking of dung, there's a wild little trick from some folk traditions. Cow dung socks. Don't panic. You're not wearing dung. You're burning it. Dried cow dung, when lit in a safe little brazier, often just a metal pan or clay bowl, gives off a steady, smokeless heat. Some folks would sit by it, feet bare, soaking up warmth. Others believed that rubbing the soles with warm ash helped chase out the chill. Historians still argue whether it worked or just made your feet smell like campfire sadness. But it's one of those survival oddities you don't dismiss until you're desperate. Some monasteries handed out foot salves in winter, mixtures of lard, beeswax, crushed herbs, and sometimes vinegar. Applied to the soles before wrapping, they created a thin seal against moisture and softened cracked skin. Did it help? Maybe. Did it sting if you had open blisters? Oh yes, painfully. But a little sting was better than losing a toe. Because yes, frostbite happened. People lost toes, sometimes whole feet. In severe winters, the elderly were most at risk, followed by children, then anyone who had to walk far, shepherds, messengers, or poor souls sent to collect water from a half-frozen stream. There are reports from Eastern Europe of entire villages strapping hot stones to their feet, wrapped in rags, and changing them out throughout the day. One chronicler described a woman with feet like waxen stumps, who yet fetched bread as if driven by the angels, which is a poetic way of saying she walked on frostbitten feet because no one else could. But let's not forget the final insult: wet socks. Once your wraps or shoes got soaked, which they inevitably did, you had two options. 1. Take them off, dry them by the fire, and risk your bare feet freezing. 2. Leave them on, squish around all day, and develop a rash that made you walk like a duck on hot gravel. Most chose the squish. It was safer. And you couldn't always spare the fuel to dry things properly. Fires took wood. Wood took time and strength to gather. Some poor families rationed firewood so severely that shoes were dried in bed, under the covers, next to freezing bodies. You'd wake up with a damp boot in your armpit. That was someone's job, sleeping foot dryer. Of course, the wealthy wore fur-lined boots, squirrel, fox, or sheepskin. They had cobblers who added thick soles, decorative stitching, even tiny iron tacks to prevent slipping on ice. You had none of that. You had scraps, straw, and stubbornness. So now you're walking, shoes creaking, toes numb, straw poking out like your shoes are molting. You pass a cart with a broken wheel, frozen in place. A woman stands nearby, her cloak billowing in the wind, her feet in wooden pattens 2 sizes too big. She nods at you. Her eyes say it all. My feet hurt too. You walk on, because what else is there to do? Medieval feet didn't get a break. They just got cold. You smell it before you see it. Animal skin. Musky, heavy, sour sweet, with hints of rot and wood smoke. It's draped over a fence post, stiff with last night's frost, still damp from being snowed on. You pause, step closer. This isn't just a cloak. It's someone's lifeline. A rawhide, unlined, lopsided slab of boiled cow, maybe. Or deerskin if they were lucky. Maybe pig. You can't tell anymore. The stink's too strong, the surface too worn. But one thing's for sure, it's warm. You grab it, not to steal it, just to borrow the idea. Because today's mission is finding animal remains to wear. Yes, really. You don't have nylon puffers. You have animals. Dead ones. You've got to make use of every part they leave behind. In the Middle Ages, fur and hide weren't fashion. They were winter armor. The poor scavenged from the bones of their livestock. Goats, sheep, deer if they could snare one. The skin would be scraped, stretched, dried, or cured if someone knew how. But curing required knowledge, materials, and time, which meant most folks just wore semi-treated skins. These were stiff, oily, sometimes lice-infested, and sometimes, let's be honest, still a little bloody. You know it's time to wrap one around your shoulders when your wool layers no longer trap heat, but instead sponge in moisture. Animal skins added that final bulk barrier. Not pretty, just effective. Especially if the fur's still on. Fur inward was warmer, of course, but fur outward looked more intimidating to wolves. Not that it helped much. Wolves were cold too. If you lived near forests or mountains, you might see people in badger capes, fox skin vests, or even a patchwork of squirrel pelts sewn together like a ghastly checkerboard. Squirrel was especially common in Eastern Europe and Russia, sometimes called vair. Nobles flaunted it. Peasants patched it. You might sew a squirrel head right over your heart for luck, or warmth, or because it was the only piece that wasn't falling apart. Now here's the catch. Fur was heavily regulated. Sumptuary laws in many regions forbade peasants from wearing the good stuff. Beaver, sable, ermine, those were for nobility. Even if you found one of those animals, killed it yourself, and cured it with your own hands, you could be fined or worse for stepping outside looking too above your station. Historians still debate whether this was about class distinction or religious modesty, but either way, warmth came with strings attached. You settle on a sheepskin vest. It smells like lanolin and dirt. The fleece inside is yellowed and clumpy. Still, it works. Slipping it on is like stepping into a damp, itchy hug from a particularly greasy relative. But you feel a difference almost instantly. The chill that's been digging at your spine backs off, just a little. And then there are fur mittens. If you're truly lucky, you have a pair. Sewn from rabbit or weasel, tied at the wrist with a cord. Most folks didn't bother with individual fingers, just mittens, sometimes lined with straw or wool scraps. Those who didn't own them made do with sleeves so long they swallowed the hands, or they just kept their hands under their arms, sleeves folded tight, hoping to keep blood moving. One charming fringe case, a monastery record from Yorkshire, notes that a monk named Simon wore 2 skinned hairs tied to each hand with string. No thumbs. just full rabbits, paws and all, dangling like the world's most desperate gloves. Other monks complained. Simon, reportedly, felt no shame, only warmth. Not everyone had access to these resources, though. Cattle hides were a favorite, especially in farming communities, but they were heavy, stiff, and took forever to dry. People cut them into long strips to use as belts, ties, or even wrap around shin guards. Some even soaked the hide in water and let it freeze on the body. An accidental innovation historians still argue about. Did it create an insulating crust, or just give you hypothermia faster? No one agrees. Wearing skins had social meaning too. In many pagan communities, it signaled a connection to the spirit of the animal. Even long after Christianity spread, some superstitions lingered. Fur from a night-killed fox was said to ward off illness. Goat hide was believed to absorb curses. You didn't just wear these pieces, you absorbed their power, their heat, their wildness. A sort of wearable folklore. And speaking of smell, oh, you smelled. Animal skins that weren't fully treated kept all their oils, their bacteria, their presence. You could be nose-blind to it after a few weeks, but dogs weren't. Wolves weren't. And neither were other villagers. If you wore a hide long enough, people might give you space out of fear you were either contagious or cursed. Now, you step outside again. The sheepskin vest hugs your torso, your hood's pulled down. Mittens, if you have them, are stiff from yesterday's frozen breath. You look to the horizon. Smoke rises from a few huts. A woman passes, bundled in what looks like stitched fox and felt. Her child toddles behind her in a squirrel pelt, stitched so roughly it still has a tail hanging off the back. Some communities stitched entire cloaks from mouse pelts, hundreds of tiny pieces painstakingly tacked together. Not for luxury, just because they had mice, and cold, and time. But no matter the fur, the goal remains the same. Stay warm, stay alive. No one's trying to impress anyone. You're all just trying to make it through one more night. And when night comes, you don't take these layers off. You sleep in them. You wrap yourself in hide and wool and breath-dampened linen, bury your face in straw, and listen to the wind crawl across your thatch roof like it's looking for a way in. You're warm, sort. You've got fur over wool over linen over skin. Your shoes are full of straw. Your sleeves are stretched past your hands, and your hood's practically stitched to your scalp. But there's one fatal flaw in all this. Water. Wetness is your nemesis. Your layers trap heat, but if they get soaked by snow, by sleet, by that charming mix of melted slush and pig filth that fills the village path, they become heavy, clammy, freezing prisons clinging to your body like remorse. So, how did medieval people stay dry? They didn't. Not really. But they tried. And some of their attempts were weird, wild, and occasionally brilliant. You start by smearing animal fat on your shoes, boiled down from pigs, sheep, or even fish. This greasy substance was rubbed directly into leather and wool to make it more water-resistant. It works. Kind of. For a while. Then it wears off and your shoes go soggy again, so you reapply, frequently. And yes, your feet now smell like mutton. The same went for cloaks. A heavy wool cloak, especially if felted, that is, mashed and boiled until it resembles a thick rug, was surprisingly good at repelling water. Not waterproof, but water shedding. People often rubbed beeswax or tallow into the surface, letting it soak in like natural waterproofing. The downside? Beeswax stiffens in the cold. Suddenly, your cloak crinkles like frozen parchment, and you walk like a man wrapped in roofing tile. In Scandinavia, people used fish oil on clothing. Cod liver oil, to be precise. It soaked into the seams of boots and mittens, giving garments a slippery, slightly translucent gleam, and a smell that could floor a badger. One Norse poem even refers to a man stinking of the sea in winter's breath, which scholars think was probably affectionate. Probably. And then there were the wild cards. Some communities in Central Europe used egg yolk emulsions. Yes, egg yolks mixed with chalk and water to create a kind of weatherproofing glaze. It didn't last long, but it created a thin seal over wool that could keep out sleet for a day, maybe two. Then it peeled, like skin. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice or just a desperate improvisation during bad winters. Either way, it's not coming to an outdoor gear store near you anytime soon. Meanwhile, some believed in charms and blessings. You'd sew a silver coin into your cloak hem to ward off water spirits, or stitch a prayer into the collar using red thread. In Welsh folklore, a cloak worn during a baptism was said to protect against rain for a year. In Slavic traditions, garments blessed by a midwife were thought to repel storm winds. These ideas weren't fringe. They were faith woven into fabric. People did what they could. And let's not forget the fashionably soggy elite. Nobles, especially those in castles, had access to waxed cloth, a coarse linen or canvas soaked in melted beeswax and sometimes resin. This created something akin to oilskin used for traveling cloaks and saddle covers. It was expensive, stiff, and often cracked in the cold, but it worked better than fat-soaked wool. And if you were rich enough, you didn't care how bad you smelled. But you're poor. You've got no wax, maybe a chunk of mutton fat if you bartered well. So, instead, you get clever. You layer multiple cloaks, the inner dry, the outer sacrificial. You sew a strip of oiled leather over your shoulders, where rain hits hardest. You hang a sheep's bladder over your chest, thin, flexible, semi-waterproof. It looks ridiculous, but it blocks wind like a charm. And sometimes you just embrace the damp. You wear old, already wet garments as your outer layer, because if you're going to get soaked, better to soak what's already ruined. This sacrificial dressing technique shows up in some 13th century rural inventories. Weather gear listed separately from garments for feast or Sabbath clothes. You had your Sunday best and your Wednesday slopwear. Children, meanwhile, got even less. Small cloaks made of stitched together rags, old tunics repurposed into ponchos. Some households wrapped kids in reeds or bark strips, peeled from winter trees and twisted into mats. Not warm, not comfortable, but marginally water-shedding. And there's always the roof. If rain pours down, snow soaks through, or wind turns sideways, you go inside. But even that's not simple. Most peasant huts leak. Thatched roofs absorb moisture like sponges. Ceilings drip. Chimneys don't draw properly. You might end up sitting in the driest corner of your single room, holding your cloak over your knees, watching your boots steam near the fire, listening to the plop, plop, plop of water dripping from the rafters. Then, you dry your clothes. If there's firewood, if there's time, you string a line above the hearth, hang your sodden hose, your steaming mittens, your flattened shoes. Everything smells like smoke and damp wool. If you're lucky, it dries overnight. If not, you wear it wet tomorrow. One monk's diary from 1427 described winter as a season in which men carry their blankets on their backs and dry them with their breath. That's not poetry. That's literal. Your cloak is your blanket. Your own body is the heater. You turn slowly in the wind like a roast, hoping to warm one side at a time. And on truly desperate days, you stay put. You curl under every layer, inside your home or your barn or the neighbor's pig shelter. You sit near the embers. You let the smoke stiffen your garments into armor. You wait. Because in the Middle Ages, staying dry was a fantasy. You didn't dodge the weather. You endured it. Somewhere deep in your bones, you feel it. The unfairness of it all. You've done everything right. Layered linen, wool, and hide. Smeared your shoes with fat. Patched your hose with goat hair. Smoked yourself like a side of pork in front of the hearth. And yet, your fingers still sting. Your toes still go numb. And your clothes still hang heavy and wet. Because the truth is, in the medieval world, how warm you stayed often came down to one brutal factor: how much you were allowed to wear. Welcome to the world of clothing laws, where your body heat was not entirely your business. In medieval Europe, laws dictated not just how people dressed, but how warmly they were allowed to dress. These were called sumptuary laws, and they were as petty as they were chilling, literally. Let's say you're a peasant. That's probably a safe assumption. You're not legally permitted to wear ermine, sable, or anything even remotely noble-looking. You might not even be allowed dyed wool in certain shades, like crimson, deep blue, or rich black. Those colors signal wealth, power, station, which means warmth, as it turns out, was also a social signal. And if you're a woman, double the restrictions. Married women of certain classes were expected to cover their heads and dress modestly, but modest often meant fewer layers, thinner fabrics, less fur. You could be fined or even punished for appearing too luxurious, even if all you wanted was to not die of exposure before Lent. You watch the Reeve pass now, middle management of the manor world. He's wearing a dark cloak, fur-trimmed, probably rabbit or even imported squirrel. It's legal for him. He owns land, he supervises labor, and crucially, he's not you. You, in contrast, wear what's legal, not necessarily what's effective. And that's the constant tension of medieval winter wear, the unspoken battle between class and survival. Do you break the rules to stay warm? Stitch an old bit of fox fur into your collar and hope no one notices? Dye your wool with crushed berries to give it that soft, forbidden purple? Or do you obey, shiver, and pray your fingers don't go black before spring? This wasn't just about law. It was about access. Richer folks had padded doublets, quilted gambesons, yes, the same ones worn under armor, velvet linings, imported cotton. Cotton! Imagine that. A fabric that actually holds warmth and doesn't smell like damp barn the minute it rains. But cotton was expensive, imported. Most peasants never even saw it, let alone wore it, and don't even start on silk. Some high-ranking clerics had silk-lined winter robes, not because it was warm, it wasn't, but because it was prestigious. Meanwhile, you're tying grass into your boots. But here's the thing. Peasants weren't stupid. They bent the rules. Quietly, creatively. Illicit tailoring was a thing. Someone in the village knew how to turn scraps of noble cast-offs into practical warmth. Old hoods were reversed and redyed. Cuffs lined with unauthorized fur. Hats shaped like those seen in manor halls, but made of rags. There's a story from 1320 about a shepherd who was fined for appearing in a coat not fit for his station. That coat? Probably something he stitched himself, using squirrel pelt and a bit of dyed cloth found in a ditch. He paid the fine, then wore it anyway. Because frostbite cares nothing for legal precedent. And the church? Oh, they had opinions. Warmth was considered a kind of temptation. Too many layers made you soft. Too much comfort made you worldly. Monks and nuns were expected to embrace austerity, thin robes, sandals, open cloisters even in winter, which led to creative disobedience. There are records of monks secretly lining their habits with mouse fur, nuns stitching extra panels into their scapulars. A particularly scandalous case involved a friar caught wearing 2 pairs of hose. The horror. He defended himself by saying, "The Lord made winter, and it would be prideful to defy his chill with only suffering." Historians still argue whether that was sarcasm or theology. Children, too, suffered most from the class gap. Noble children had hand-sewn garments, miniature cloaks, even mittens stitched by servants. Peasant kids wore what their siblings outgrew, sometimes even what their dead siblings left behind. Clothes weren't inherited. They were recycled. One village midwife kept a bundle of emergency baby clothes made from patched wool and rabbit fur. She called it the warmth of the dead. You pull your own cloak tighter now. It's legal. It's scratchy. It barely covers your legs, but it's better than nothing. And when no one's looking, you flip the collar up, revealing a strip of illegal squirrel skin sewn into the lining, just enough to keep the back of your neck from cracking like dry parchment, just enough to keep your head clear, your breath visible, your dignity barely intact. You pass a merchant, visibly sweating in 4 layers of quilted silk. He sneers. You nod. You keep walking. Because here's the quiet truth of medieval survival. Rules were only as strict as the wind was warm. In winter, even the reeve looked the other way. Even the priest wrapped his hands in extra cloth. Even the law bent beneath the weight of snow on the rooftops. And so, you survive. Not comfortably, not legally sometimes, but you do. In stolen fur, in borrowed socks, in disobedient warmth, you survive. Night falls fast in winter. One moment you're trudging along, breath fogging, cheeks numb, thinking maybe, just maybe, you've gotten used to the cold. The next, the light is gone, the wind has teeth, and every part of you tightens against the icy dark. It's time to sleep, or try to. You don't undress. That would be madness. Every layer stays on. The dirt, the sweat, the wet patches near your cuffs. You keep it all. Because in the medieval winter, you sleep dressed like you're already in the grave, tightly wrapped, still, not trusting the night to spare you. You lie down not in a bed, but in something that only vaguely qualifies as one. A sack of straw if you're lucky, a hard bench if you're not. The straw is cold and crunchy. It's damp in the corners and smells faintly of mice. You settle in anyway. Your sheepskin cloak is folded over your legs. Your wool hood stays up. Your shoes, still stuffed with straw, stay on. Feet exposed to the air at this hour. Might as well write a will. There's someone next to you. Probably several someones. Medieval sleeping wasn't solitary. It wasn't romantic either. You spoon for heat, not affection. You curl against your siblings, your parents, sometimes even neighbors if the cold is that bad. It's awkward. It's crowded. It's loud with breathing, snoring, occasional groaning. But it's warmer than sleeping alone. Records from rural manors suggest whole families shared a single bed or platform during winter. Children at the center, adults on the outside, like human walls, animals nearby. A pig under the bed, a chicken on a beam overhead. Warmth was a group project. If one person moved, everyone felt it. You might even sleep sitting up, back against the hearth, knees tucked in, arms around your legs. Why? Because lying flat feels colder. The heat rises, and the floor is deathly cold. Some chroniclers describe elderly peasants who slept in their chairs near the fire, covered in cloaks like funerary statues, waking only to stoke the embers or cough. One peculiar practice in the Alps involved warming rocks in the hearth and placing them at the foot of the bed, wrapped in cloth or bark to avoid burns. It helped, for an hour or two. Then the cold crept back, sly and unstoppable, and you curled tighter. Sometimes the only thing to do was pray. A whispered Ave, a muttered Paternoster, not for forgiveness, for warmth, for morning, for a fire that would light without fuss, and frost that wouldn't crack your nails off before breakfast. Lord, let us wake, one woman supposedly said every night before sleeping. Not good night, just let us wake. But not everyone had beds. Some lay on the bare floor, wrapped in whatever they had. Others slept in barns, on hay, between cows or sheep, borrowing body heat from animals too dumb to mind. It was common, even expected. In especially bad years, entire families moved into the livestock sheds. That's where the heat was, and where the fleas were too, but you took your chances. Now, you pull your cloak tighter. You breathe shallowly. Less air movement means less body heat lost. Your nose burns. Your fingertips tingle. The room is silent, save for the occasional creak of the roof beams or the soft hiss of wind finding a gap in the thatch. And what about nightmares? Cold sleep brought strange dreams, often of falling into ice, of teeth breaking, of wandering alone through snow that buried your knees and never ended. Medieval people sometimes blamed these dreams on demons or cold spirits. Some tucked small charms under their pillows, crosses, iron nails, sprigs of dried rosemary, to ward off the creeping things of the night. Whether those things were spirits or just the creeping chill of death, no one liked to say. You dream too, of spring, of sunlight, of feeling your toes, of waking up without needing to check that your fingers still move. It's a distant thing, this dream, but not impossible. Morning will come. You just have to make it to then. You fall asleep layered like a corpse, curled like a fern, clutching the edge of your cloak in a room that hasn't seen heat in weeks. You fall asleep hoping that no one needs to fetch water tonight, hoping that tomorrow is only cold and not colder. And somehow, most nights, you do wake up. Let yourself sink now into that imagined bed of straw and skin and stubbornness. The layers are heavy on your body, pressing down with the quiet weight of survival. The air is cold but still, and the only sound is your breath. Steady, slow, fogging slightly with each exhale as your body clings to what little warmth it can find. You curl tighter under your cloak, wrapping your arms around your middle, your legs drawn in, your chin tucked low. Around you, others shift and breathe, a chorus of slow, sleeping bodies wrapped in linen and hope. No one speaks. There's nothing left to say. Just the deep rhythm of bodies surviving another night, another century. Let your thoughts drift now, slow and wandering, like smoke from a winter hearth. The past is far away, and the cold is just a whisper. You are wrapped in wool, in fur, in quiet. The night stretches long, but you are safe inside it. Tired, warm enough, alive. There is no wind now, no snow, just the soft hush of sleep pulling you down, deeper and deeper, until even the sharp edges of frost seem distant. Sleep well, traveler. You've earned it.